Okay, well, there you go. So I was listening to Graham talking about the speed at which the computers can play and win over itself. I'm listening to Kelly talking about some of the societal problems of inequities. And coming from a policy background in government, my thought was I was starting to build on something that Jim was talking about. And I was thinking that if such a super intelligent AI system is really good, as Graham said, as accomplishing its goals, and the code programmers are programming in, but it starts to make its own decisions. And if those goals aren't lined up with our value system, like Jim said with the ethics. So he partially answered my question by saying that a well-funded international network and adopting it across the planet. Having worked in government, that's going to take way long to do. And I think of the EU trying to adopt directives on certain subjects and how they're still discussing stuff they talked about 15 years ago. So I'm wondering what sort of, Kelly called it a human caretaker, what sort of framework we could put in place, Canada's leading, as Graham said, that would balance all of that innovation and yet not allow these things to get maybe out of control. So Jim sort of asked the question. So I'm going to jump to Kelly first, and then Graham, and then I'll open it up for discussion with the audience and the panel. So Kelly, what do you think?
About Jim's suggestion?
Yeah.
I
do you think it would work?
Yeah. My question is, who's we and who's our? Again, thinking about bias or exclusion, especially in computer programming. You know, Google's under a lawsuit right now where 2 in 10 women at Google work in computer programming at Google. You know, there's a massive underrepresentation of women, of minorities. I talked about omission in terms of particular kinds of food system values, motivating designers of AI systems in the ag sector. So I like your idea of a steering committee, but then, you know, thinking about how to constitute that committee in order to figure out our values, right? In order to figure out what values and what notions of good are then programmed into, or ethics, right? What ethical framework or moral framework, is programmed into this open source machine. I like the idea in principle. So maybe to follow up on Jim and my sort of concern around that proposition and an answer of your question, I would say, what about inclusivity as a kind of framework? You know, we have this directive right now in the Canadian government coming from Minister Baines around inclusive innovation, and it's cross-sectoral. There's not a lot of guidance as to, I think we're still unclear on what we mean. But I think if we think of gender imbalance among the people designing AI systems, if we think of the underrepresentation of historically marginalized folks across the board, what about including more of those people in the decision-making at the design stage? So there's another sort of overarching, I would say, policy framework called responsible innovation. And it calls for including early on, it's called upstream, right, at the design stage, including or you know, thinking about value frameworks, thinking about why we're taking an artificial intelligence system in a particular direction, or a research program in a particular direction, for whom, right? Who benefits and also who might lose. So I would say inclusivity as a general principle, and the responsible innovation rubric or policy framework might be helpful in providing some guidance as to how to roll that out.
Okay,
Yeah.
Thanks. Graham, what do you think?
Sure. So I definitely think there's a lot more people working on the tech side of AI than there are on the responsible AI side. So I think being very explicit in trying to encourage more people working on safety, ethics, bias, fairness, transparency, all these sorts of issues that we've talked about is really important. And I also think that I don't want to see us slowing down basic research in AI on the tech side or on the responsibility side. but really focusing on, right at this point in time, applications that we don't want to see happen. So as an example of this, some of you may have been aware of a petition that went to the Canadian government, I think it was late last year, asking for a ban on autonomous weapons. And recently, even more recently, there's been discussion in the news on Project Maven, which is a Department of Defense funded project that Google has been working on to aid in the analysis of airborne imagery for detecting certain targets on the ground. And there's also been a petition signed just a couple weeks ago, several researchers asking for Google not to participate in DoD funded research. So I like, again, this idea of encouraging sort of more ethical thought in AI, funding it as well as we fund the technical side of AI, and basically listening to people's fears right now and steering AI away from the applications that we don't want to see.
Okay, Jim, I'll actually give you a last word.
Okay.
Since you brought it
Yeah.
up.
So I think that we tend to focus on our differences. They're very interesting. You know, I like Star Wars and you like Star Trek or something. And people do have real ethical, there's variance in what people think is right and wrong. However, there is so much that just about everybody agrees on that we still have no idea how to productively program into a computer, that we have so much work to do before we even get to abortion or other like divisive ethical issues. And I'm encouraged by some historical precedents of how quickly we came up with a Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And people tended to agree. Studies show that when people from different cultures are required to come up with an agreed upon code of ethics, they tend to turn to utilitarianism rather naturally. And with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, there was a condition that they would all agree to it, but no one was allowed to ask why they agreed to it. So even people from different religions would agree that harm is bad, but they would not, they didn't want to, but to justify it with their own religion would cause people to, start arguing and have trouble. So I do respect that there are differences between people, but I think there's a lot of work that we can all agree on.
I wasn't disagreeing with your idea in principle. I was just suggesting that I would want us, and again, who's us, but some careful thought given to who would populate that kind of decision-making body. Because if you're looking, it sounded like you were suggesting people with technical capacity, and if you look currently at the industry, it's dominated by, there's not a whole lot of diversity.
Oh,
and I think that could be then
I
reflected into
I don't think it should be a bunch of techies at all. I think that they have, computer programmers have they know nothing about ethics unless they just have a personal interest in it. It's not something that they're required to know for their jobs or anything. So I think that there have to be tons of humanities experts and polling and scenarios run by people. I don't think it should be run by Google. I had an argument with my friend, a developer at Google, who just was irritated because he's like, oh, well, of course we're thinking about ethical issues. And I'm like, all right, fine, you're thinking about them, but we don't know what the hell's happening. And you're a bunch of engineers, who maybe read ethics in your spare time. So yeah, I do think it should be a lot of people. And it being open source would help with that, right? Because unlike the Manhattan Project, which was extraordinarily secret, an open source project where people can try to hack it, find problems with it. There can be, people writing articles about what they disagree with and this and that. And through, hopefully through the market of ideas, we can come to some kind of agreement.
There's also the pedagogic shift then, and maybe getting students of computer science to think about ethics early on.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, I'll leave that hanging. So I'm going to open it to the audience, and if you can just come up to that microphone and speak into the microphone with your questions, then you can line up or whatever, we'll take them.
Hi, lots of interesting points. I assume this is on. Let me just start with two questions for Graham, one a kind of techie and one more general. You mentioned the exponential growth in computing power, and that's Moore's law. But my understanding is mechanically the what do you call it, trace size is hitting a limit. Biomimetically, the way people have been getting around that is by much more massively parallel processing. Biomimetically, that may make sense, but is it imposing any kind of constraint on the kinds of directions in which AI might evolve by saying it has to grow or get faster using only parallel processing as opposed to other kinds of things? That's question one. And question two, much more general, you mentioned en passant that none of your graduate students wanted to look at the health area because it was too hard. So I'd appreciate hearing a bit more why you think that's hard or what aspects of it are so.
Sure. Thanks a lot for the question. So on the first one, definitely agree with you on Moore's law and the fact that a lot of the recent progress on AI has been leveraging parallelism, in particular graphics processing units or GPUs. So a lot of the software frameworks that people are using to develop these deep learning systems have sort of native support for GPUs, particularly those from NVIDIA. There's a really nice analysis just last week from OpenAI. So if you check the OpenAI blog, they talk about computing, and they look at essentially on the order of about 20 breakthroughs in AI, specifically machine learning, over the last, say, 10 years. And essentially they work out the math to show essentially how much computation was needed for those, and they actually show it is exponential, again leveraging parallelism in particular GPUs. I think there's definitely been a co-evolution of software and hardware, and people are typically talking about the algorithms and their progress and their performance and so forth. But these, particularly the GPUs and the software, have been evolving together over the last 10 years, and certainly that's constrained the way that we're thinking about AI. So yes, I mean, I don't know if I would say we sort of have to get rid of our dependence on GPUs. I think it's going to happen organically. There's a number of companies that are working on dedicated ASICs for deep learning, and that's going to it's sort of like deep learning has inherited something from GPUs. Now the ASICs are inheriting something from deep learning. So I mean, it's a bit linear, but I think with a number of companies, startups entering this hardware space, things are going to get more interesting pretty soon. Second question was on, sorry, remind me, healthcare. Yeah, so actually the comment, I have a number of students that are working on medical imaging applications, in particular things like histopathology or automated wound analysis. So we do have a couple things going on in the lab in healthcare. So they're not really shying away from healthcare as much as problems where you would have to spend a lot of time collecting data. So in both of those cases, we've partnered with companies who have already done the data collection. So that's certainly been attractive to students. It's the challenges that nobody's touched. Nobody's gone out to collect the data yet. Some of the problems on the health side, some of the problems in agriculture that Kelly referred to. The students don't want to collect data in the lab. They want to take a data set that's already on the internet or someone hands to them. And that's a little bit, I would say it's limiting some of the work that we do and the partnerships that we have.
Can I just ask a supplemental to that? Is there privacy issues involved with the collection of that healthcare data?
Yeah, so I guess in my simplified 7-minute talk, I mean, I say it's about data collection, but there's a lot more, and Kelly pointed to some of that. It's like convincing people sometimes to share the data, putting the agreements in place for privacy and so forth. So, or submitting to an IRB to actually collect data with subjects in the lab. So there's just, I guess there's so many cool problems to work on in machine learning right now. It just has general purpose technology, and there's so many data sets out there. It's a bit frustrating to think about sort of waiting for some of these things to be completed or go through the process of trying to tackle some of these harder problems when there's just so much that you could do because it's so general.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, you've thrown out two huge issues. Aside from labor displacement and privacy and transparency, which is finding, even nationally or locally, a sense of consensus around values, let alone internationally, and critically governance. And so I'd like to focus on the latter. I don't disagree that open source is a way of crowdsourcing this in a way, and a lot of critical thinkers are enamored with that approach. But what is the governance model to agree on some minimal values, either locally or nationally? Would you use Canada or the States as potential models that are dealing with this? How do you kick that up a level to the EU and let alone the United Nations, which has many challenges in taking on critical issues? So just interested in your reflections.
I don't think I understand the question. So what does this have to do with government?
So the question is, in terms of finding a common set of values and how you establish that, and you had suggested something around international and open sourced, what is the governance model for that? Do you actually roll that up through a state system or through an international body? How does it get
Are you
validated?
talking about creating the organization that
Yes.
makes the ethics, or the ethics itself?
So creating the organization that validates the ethics and creates the ethics.
So I don't have a strong opinion on which government should do it. I mean, I think that it would be great if everybody pitched in. In terms of if you were trying to make an ethical code for an artificial intelligence that you think might govern the entire world, I think it's a bit challenging to get into to try to tell it what the details of what that government should be, how many, whether it should have a Senate or something like that, right? Because the AI is going to be founded on much more deep moral principles, and it would probably discover or come up with means of governance that we haven't thought of yet that it would estimate would be better. So, I don't know if we'd even need to tell it what to start with or not. I'm not sure.
Thank you.
Kelly, do you have an idea? No?
I heard the question as what kind of models of decision making might be used, because I think to say open source is a bit. I think you need a bit more nuance there. Is that the nature of the question? What models of decision making by which to decide? What is the moral framework?
That was original thinking, but
Yeah.
how the models of decision making, yes.
There are deliberative models that are the basis of democratic society that have not been scaled up. And I mean, I don't know, this is such a huge thought experiment if you're as an international steering committee for a moral machine that's going to set the standard for our future under AI. But I think, starting with that as the basis, deliberation, and that has a very particular meaning according to democratic theory. I could unpack that, but I was thinking one sort of response to your earlier question that I just thought of. There was a standing committee report that just got released in Canada around private data, personal data. And it sort of followed closely from the Ontario Privacy Commissioner report from years ago that argued for privacy by design. I don't know if you've followed that at all, or if you, Graham. But that's one principle, for example, that could be used to drive the evolution of a system. And in that case, it's kind of forward-thinking, government official that looking at what I'm not sure, but I'm not sure whether there was a consensus process or what, but deciding that privacy, understood a particular way, is a value held by many Canadians, and then arguing for that to be written into the very design of, in this case, the use of personal data.
So I see this as a research project for the Institute of Science, Society, and Policy to figure out a bunch of, governance options or models that might work for something like this, and put all these people around the table as kind of an idea. So,
Well, you know what?
There you go.
You were allowed to announce it, but not put it in print. But I just found out I got the Canada Research Chair in Science and Society, and this is my goal. Actually, was to convene a kind of steering committee around AI, specifically in the agri-food sector in Canada, and bring together people like Graham, bring together people like Jim with myself, the social scientists, and bring together also representative members of the public, specifically historically marginalized folks. So,
Okay, so good idea.
so I'm going to do it. Yeah, it's gonna
Good
happen.
idea.
And
Great
CFAR
idea.
would probably be interested in
Yeah, I'm
funding
applying
that.
for your workshop.
Okay.
Yeah, there you go.
Okay, great. So we're on a roll. Okay, so that's the answer to your question. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you for the presentations. I have two questions. The first one is for Kelly, and I'm not fully familiar with the field of agriculture, but my understanding of the machinery and data collection deal, in a certain way, at least for a company like John Deere, was a huge part of the market, is yes, they will take the data and do whatever they want with it, but they're, in exchange, they're pretty much giving the machinery for free to the farmers. So in a certain way, my understanding is that they've switched their business model where instead of paying for the machinery, they will license it or lend it to you in exchange for the data, which begs my question of is it just a question that, first of all, my response would be that the farmers don't have to take that deal if they want to hold to their data and do not want to give it to John Deere. They're pretty much free to go with another manufacturer. So they're not stuck in that position. And if for market reasons, because they're dominant or they have an exclusive product, something else I would argue is it might just be that because they've made that pivot in their business model very recently, it's just that the market has not responded yet. So my question is the issues and you pointed out too with regards to data and the risks and that it be used for companies for certain purposes. Isn't it something that the market might fix by itself in, I don't know, maybe 10 years when it has reacted to the pivot that some companies have made? So
Yeah.
that would be my first question to you.
Oh,
And
first.
I have another one, which is this time for...
Let's do one. Can we do one question at a time?
Okay.
Yeah, I'll
Okay.
give you space for the second one. No problem.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's this, I don't know if anyone watched the HBO show The Wire. There's this great character named Homer, and he had this line called, "Ain't nothing as expensive as free." And you know, when I think of Cambridge Analytica and the use of social media data, and there's a lot of political will right now, and even, you know, response among the digital giants to the fact that these data, not only are they proprietary and can be used, they're incredibly valuable in terms of commercial value. And I think you're absolutely right, that's reflected in this business model shift by John Deere in particular, and I didn't mention that. That you know, there is an advantage then to the farmer in licensing, right? But I think there are other problems that can arise with the lack of transparency. So there's that, you know, maybe ethical issue of incommensurate benefits to the farmer and the large agribusiness. Farmers don't have a whole, you mentioned this already in your question, that farmers don't have a whole lot of options, right? There are only a handful of machinery suppliers, so they don't have a whole lot of other places they can go. But I think there are other issues besides inequity in the commercial gain from the use of farm level data. And that, I think, is highlighted by Cambridge Analytica, right? Like just the sheer fact that we can't inquire, or farmers can't inquire, but as a researcher as well, as to what's being done with the data, who's holding it and using it for what purposes, especially given some of the future scenarios that Graham pointed out. I think that's a real problem. And so then there's another principle, and I thought one of you would speak to it, but it's technological transparency, or data transparency at the very least. But.
So you other guys have
Yeah,
any?
maybe you wanna
Okay,
speak to
your
that.
second question?
My second question was for both Graham and Jim. And something I remember reading from the open letter from the Future of Life Institute, what you may have heard of, that's the group that's quoted by Elon Musk, and it may have been grandiose a little bit what they're saying, but something they identified as a bottleneck in terms of let's call it ethics or control of AI systems is, at the moment, there's a piece that is missing is research on formal theory of AI systems. So trying to build an abstract layer or an understanding at more abstract level of AI systems, so you can explore or you can model where, what's the full space of behaviors that a system can identify. And then from there, you will identify in ethics as just being, okay, I want the system to go in that place, and I don't want it to go in this space. So where they were going with that is something that's missing at this point is a way to validate the code of AI systems. So making sure that what it does, what it's programmed for, is actually what it will be doing, without even going into the moral and where the system would be going. So they identified that very slice or that very area of research as something where there's a need for more effort. And I'll just be curious to get your sense of where the research is at the moment, where are the efforts deployed, and what's a roadmap or what's something that could be done in that space to, before even trying to design a moral or ethical systems for, an ethical system for AI systems. Trying to figure out how we can have that layer where you could implement and make sure that it's translatable into systems code and actually something that could go in practice, which is a little bit of what you mentioned, saying that thinking about the values and ethics is a bit of a waste of time if we're still miles away from being able to implement it in code. So I'd just like to get your sense of where we're at in terms of research and what is needed. Thank you.
You can start.
I can start, okay. There have been a lot of, there's been work done in formalizations of moral representation and logic and that kind of thing. I think we're pretty good at coming up with formalizations. I'm not particularly concerned that we're going to know exactly what we want the computer to do, but we can't figure out a way to formalize it. I don't think that's going to be the bottleneck. I think it's more going to be what we want it to do and how the AI is going to be able to measure what's good in the world, right? For example, like you can say, oh, well, let's make everyone happy. It's like, well, how's the computer going to know if someone's happy? Well, is it smiling? Is it a brain structure? Is it a good life? And all those measurements that can be hacked and taken advantage of, just like protein in baby formula. But there is work on formalization of moral reasoning and that kind of thing.
A couple of things I would add on that. We had a visit by Jung Moon, who graduated from UBC, and she has started a company. I can't remember the name of the company, but they're doing very cool work on essentially audits and certification on the ethical side of. She describes herself as a robo-ethicist, but I think it goes beyond just not just robotics, but artificially intelligent systems. And so I kind of see that as the way we're going, like companies reaching out to an institute like hers for help with essentially auditing or thinking about the sort of more safety or sort of more generally responsibility of deploying AI systems. And then the second one that comes to mind is as engineers. So I work in a school of engineering, and I did my PhD in computer science. I did my undergrad in engineering, so I sort of sit in both camps. But as a condition of my tenure in an engineering school, I had to get a Peng. And so I wrote these law and ethics exams, and in those exams for PO, it was all construction law and civil engineering, and PO definitely needs to be upgraded to not just encompass software engineers, but also the fact that even these civil systems or water systems or environmental systems or mechanical engineering is going to be influenced by AI. I mean, we're working on systems to sort of optimize the design of micro hydro systems or turbines to generate electricity. These are being designed by algorithms now, not just by mechanical engineers. So I think there needs to be an overhaul of the different bodies like PO to recognize that there's serious ethical and legal questions around intelligent systems. And I'd be very happy to see that happen.
Yes, thank you.
Hi. So my question plays a bit of a devil's advocate, but one of my interests in artificial intelligence is evolutionary algorithms. And for anyone who doesn't know what that is, the algorithm makes random changes to itself until it finds one that makes it better. And it does this millions and millions of times until it's really good at what it does. And so this is one of the ways I think that we could get this super intelligent being that we don't actually understand how it works. And this artificial intelligence could have like a culture of its own, a language of its own. You could even call it like a species. And I think that species would be so far advanced from us. It's like us to the ape-like beings we evolved from. And so I guess my question is, given the choice, should those ape-like beings have had the decision, should have the right to decide to evolve into us or our ethics? And I guess like equally, do we even have the like cognitive ability or the right to choose the ethics of this intelligence that we're saying is so far above us that we wouldn't even understand how it works?
So there is a suggestion in the AI ethics literature that we should just offload the learning of the ethics to the thing that's so much smarter than us to begin with, right? And there are a lot of problems with it that I can't recall right now. But but part of it is, you know, I think it's easy to think about a very intelligent computer as being kind of like a person, and that is a very dangerous thing because we think about like, well, we'll have it learn its own ethics or learn its own morality, and that presupposes an understanding of the term ethics and morality that we can't assume the software shares with us. And even in that very definition of what we're telling it to learn what's right and wrong, our very description of what right and wrong is going to, in a large part, determine what it figures out and what kind of number is it maximizing eventually. That's going to boil down to. So yeah, that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah. There's a kind of Frankenstein's monster scenario, right? I was kind of trying to make that point that, you know, there's still a person behind that evolutionary system, and does that person not have a responsibility ultimately? I would say yes, but I come from a particular values-based position as a critical social scientist.
I also want to add that, and similar to the problem Graham is talking about, ethics does not appear to be the kind of thing we have tons of raw data sitting in the database for. So, you know, if you were using evolutionary algorithms to try to create a moral machine, what would be your fitness function or training that would, you know, in that case, the fitness function would have to implement, in some sense, the kind of ethics you want it to end up with, right? So it's I think it's a tricky problem.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, we read that AI researchers are intent on making a computer act and think more like a human. But as machines and computers do more and more for us, raises the question, is there a fear that mankind will be inclined to think he does not have to learn and know as much as we do now about whether it's mundane matters like what is a degree centigrade on your thermostat indoors, or more complex matters like driving a car? Will we stop learning? Other than researchers and academics, of course, accepted from that.
So do we get lazy?
I think I've mentioned already a couple ways that I've sort of augmented my life using AI tools. So one is like writing less email. I guess maybe understanding or memorizing less sort of maps or districts in a region because we have mapping tools on our device. There's a really interesting anecdote in a book called Prediction Machines by Ajay Agarwal, Joshua Gans, and Abby Goldfarb. So it's a book that was released maybe 4 weeks ago as a popular introduction to AI systems. It's really great. Something that they talk about in that book is the London cabbie, so London, UK. Cabbies is formally trained for 3 years, studying this exam, learning all the maps of the city, knowing how to get from A to B, and so forth. And then, boom, mapping apps hit. People have cell phones. They open up Google Maps. It can tell them how to drive to A to B in the sort of most optimized way, and they can drive an Uber now. So it's not really that the cabbies have been eliminated by AI systems directly, but the AI has sort of leveled the playing field, and it's changed the knowledge that you need to know. But now people need to know how to effectively use these apps and so forth. So I think, well, in my opinion, our lives will change, our jobs will change, but our jobs are composed of so many thousands of tasks that we do, and some of those tasks will be handed off to machines, but new tasks will come in that we need to learn. And so we'll just be evolving, and we will continue to learn. I don't think we'll stop learning.
Okay, last question.
Well, two, if I may. First, something about the intersection between health and privacy. My impression from your answer which is not surprising. You know, the students will go where the data are easiest to collect. And so if you're looking at pattern recognition for tumors and radiographic images, that's something much more tractable for a student in computer science or AI. The real benefits, I think, would come from utilizing the huge and increasing mass of data that's coming from electronic patient records. Trouble is, those are all bottled up by a bunch of, to my taste, excessive privacy restrictions. So I know Ann Cavoukian and privacy by design kind of ideas. The challenge we have here is there are, sorry to say, vested interests on various sides of the privacy question, so that deputy ministers of health and physicians don't want to be embarrassed by what an AI system or somebody who's doing good predictive analytics will see about the way heart attacks, for example, are treated in the country. So there's a deeper and more political economy kind of issue there. Now bouncing back to your, you know, I've been reading science fiction since I was a kid. I'm reminded a little bit, there was an old book, Oliver Stapleton, The Last Men, which talks about successive, 18 waves of evolution, where the previous version of Homo sapiens got replaced by the successive one. It sounds kind of optimistic to talk about open source project for embedding ethics into these increasingly sophisticated AI systems. But isn't the history of the planet and what we see in all kinds of biological systems a competition and basically an arms race? So that isn't it much more likely that we'll see an arms race of one kind of AI versus another? And maybe it'll be white hat, black hat?
Let's do the first question first.
On the first part of that, a quick response is I think these sorts of large-scale health-related applications will either be developed by companies, or because you can see the recent announcement, Daphne Kohler, professor at Stanford, starting a new healthcare-focused company for diagnostics. I think those will be either developed in the private sector or developed in other jurisdictions where there's less privacy regulation. So again, going back to the government, do you want these to be developed in Canada for Canadians, or is this going to be something that we port over that have been developed in other jurisdictions?
The real risk is have a bunch of US firms trying to sell their software into Canada.
Yeah, it's going to happen.
Did you have a last comment, Jim, or no?
There will be an arms race, absolutely. So the open source software has to be attractive enough that we hope people will use it. So yeah, there's no avoiding. AI is already in arms race kind of conditions with people rushing to get things done, and so that and the fact that the ethics would have to be voluntarily taken up means that part of the design of this code would have to include reasons for people to use it. And then we hope.
Okay, so on behalf of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy and the Royal Canadian Institute for Science, I want to first thank the three speakers, and they gave you this afternoon their most valuable resource, which is their time. So with a little bit of history from the RCI and from ISSP, thank you, Graham, for coming. Thank you, Kelly. And thank you, Jim. Thanks also to all those people behind the scenes that make this happen, from ISSP, Raphael, and from the Royal Canadian Institute for Science, Kat and Annalise, that made this all come together, and your refreshments at the back. And thanks to you all for coming to listen, and I hope this discussion with the panel all made you think. So if you watch our site, or ISSP site, we'll have more of these types of engaging panels coming up in the future. So I think the panelists will be available for a couple of minutes for your additional conversation. I think there's a little bit of refreshments at the back. So thank you, and have a great and safe evening.